Yes, you did.
A few things before we get started this evening. The men's bathroom is in the northwest corner of the building. Ladies' bathroom, just go through the doors here, take an immediate right, and just head straight back. It's the ladies' room. We are in the midst of a renovation, and so we appreciate your patience. We were working late last night trying to finish a few things before we all arrived. We're going to continue working tomorrow, so it's kind of interesting trying to do this in the midst of a work zone. But it is a great privilege for us to have you here this evening. Just if you're not familiar with us, we are a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. There are two congregations of this denomination here in Utah, ours and Berea Presbyterian in Ogden, where Curtis Eggleston is the pastor. We are a remnant of Bible-believing Presbyterians. We consider ourselves to be the heirs of the Protestant Reformation. In a time where the gospel had been lost to man-made traditions, the Protestant Reformation was a return to the Bible. The Bible was taught. The Bible was preached. The Bible was sung, especially in the Psalms. Prayers were shaped by the Bible. The whole of Christian life was brought back to God's Word, and that has been our intent. It's our belief that the church stands on three legs if it is to be biblical. Biblical truth, a biblical relationship with God in terms of worship, especially, and a biblical relationship with one another. We are doing this conference because in our generation, we have pastors, a pastor ordained in the very same denomination that I was, who left and went a different direction, was quoted just this week as arguing that people claim that we have unity if we have truth. He argued that no, if we have unity, then we have truth. It is our belief that we go back to God's Word and we find our unity standing together on substance. And so we are pressed back to God's Word. We're doing this conference to promote the comforting idea that what we have with one another and what we have with God can stand in the light of the brightest light. We are very privileged to have Dr. James White with us. He has helped us in the past. He has done debates for us before he was run off by people who thought protesting him was more important than a whole lot of other things. Literally, the street preachers put on skinhead wigs and held up a banner with a quote from Letters to a Mormon Elder and were screaming at the Mormons, "We're with him! We're with him!" It was sad. But Dr. White took pity on us when he saw what was billed as the confrontation back in February. And he wrote me and asked me, "What is your congregation doing July 1st through 5th? And with both of us having at least some exposure to Southern culture, I said, adding some water to the grits and showing you some Southern hospitality, if you're up to it. He responded back, he said, "How about I come out, I train for a couple of races in Colorado later in the month during the day, and then I make my most popular presentations at night. No speaking fee, no honorarium, it's just our gift to you to try to encourage the ministry there." He said, "How does that sound?" I was tempted to get gushy, but knowing James, I hesitated and I wrote back in the words of Lawrence Well, "Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful." Wonderful, wonderful. So we are having light refreshments. Apparently, when we got it all put out on the plates, we figured out it was going to be a little lighter than we thought. But we do have refreshments. We have pink lemonade and cookies afterwards. We encourage you to stick around. We are in an increasingly hostile culture, and I think it is important that we find our unity in our common Lord, in our common faith. And I'm thrilled to see people from other congregations, including a number of pastors from Baptist churches and others here. I think we need to, instead of laying aside everything and trying to find unity on the lowest common denominator, recognize that we stand together on the things for which our forefathers died. So it's my great privilege to introduce to you Dr. James White. He is the author of over 24 books, Letters to a Mormon Elder, Is the Mormon My Brother, God Who Justifies, The Forgotten Trinity, Same-Sex Controversy, and the list goes on and on. He has participated in over 130 formal moderated debates. I'm not sure if you count those that I moderated, because I tended to go easy on his opponents, because back during the bodybuilding days, one of his opponents, I told him it would not have been more lopsided if it was a wrestling match. James towered over him in every way. He weighed about 98 pounds soaking wet. His arguments were bizarre. Another opponent, I was afraid, was literally about to have a stroke. James asked him, we'll be bringing in some chairs in a moment here. This is a good thing. Not to pull many of you away from good churches, but y'all are welcome. We've not had this many people in here before. There are a few spaces if you can try to make some room.
There's a 2-spot right here, and a couple down here. You have to sit next to the projector, but other than that. There's a single spot right here. So great view, too, honestly.
There's not a lot of room to move around, but for information for tomorrow, if you are hot-natured and you would like to be cooler, this area where the small cooler is blowing down is much, much better.
Probably a tree right here
than it is in some other areas. But it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. James White.
I'm reminded about 10 years or so ago, we had a debate in Brooklyn, New York, at a very old Presbyterian church. It was a beautiful, beautiful building. It could seat over 800 people. And unfortunately, it had gone liberal a long time ago. And so for the past 50 years or so, the most people they'd ever had in there was about 20 at the time. And I debated the imam of the largest mosque in New York City. And so we packed 800 Muslims into that room. And you should have seen the 3 or 4 Presbyterians that showed up to their own church. They were sort of looking around like, what happened? We sell? We're not sure. So it is great to see you all here this evening. I would have lots of gushing things to say about Jason and stuff, but I don't have time this evening. We'll have a little bit more time during the rest of the week. But I'll be honest with you, this subject I consider to be one of the most important subjects I address. I've given this presentation in Australia, in South Africa a number of times. I'll be giving it again. I'll be teaching an entire class based on this in Kiev in September. And so I really do think this is an incredibly important subject for a number of reasons. Obviously, up here in the Salt Lake Valley, it's certainly understandable why a discussion of reliability of the New Testament doctrine should be relevant. Most of you know the 8th article of the LDS Church, Articles of Faith, says we give the Bible the Word of God as far as it's translated correctly. What does that mean? Depends on which Mormon you talk to, obviously. But in my experience down through the years, I've heard things like many plain, precious truths have been removed from the Bible, and have had many instances where an LDS person would say, well, yeah, that does seem to cause a contradiction, a problem between the Bible and our scriptures, but look, your scriptures have been altered, they have been changed. Very similar argumentation when I deal with my Muslim friends. I've been doing a lot of debates with Muslims, even in mosques recently, and basically once you establish what the text of the Bible says that contradicts something that Muhammad said, something that's found in the Quran, something that's found in the Hadith, basically the response is, well, it's been changed, it's been altered, it's been corrupted. They may not be able to tell you when, how, why, but it's been corrupted. Now, putting the religious movements aside that have vested interest, shall we say, in saying the Bible has been corrupted, we as Christian people send our children into universities, send our children into contexts such as that. And right now, it is absolutely the consistent message that they're going to receive in any context like that we cannot trust what is found in the text of the Bible. Now, let me just mention in passing, I will have to this evening focus upon the New Testament. The Old Testament is a fascinating story as well, but it's a very, very different story. And of course, there are sections of the Old Testament that are extremely ancient, and so it requires us going into some very complicated material to deal with the Old Testament text. Besides that, most of the argumentation that we will encounter is people claiming that we don't know what was written in the New Testament text, especially even in light of what happened on Friday, for example. If we try to engage our culture in a discussion of even such things as basic as what Jesus taught on marriage or sexuality or anything like that, you'll have a lot of people who say, well, but we don't know what Jesus said. We can't tell that what is written in the New Testament really reflects what he believed, etc., etc., etc. So no matter who we are as Christians today, no matter who we're trying to reach out and speak a word of truth to, the reality is this subject becomes absolutely central to any kind of apologetic attempt on our part at all. Now, my grandparents' generation didn't need to know a whole lot about this, I'll have to admit. There was a general respect for and honor of the Bible in most of culture at that time. But those days are long past. And there's a lot of false information out there that is popularly repeated, and you know how it works in our culture today. As long as you repeat something enough times, people just come to the conclusion that it's true because it's been said by so many people, rather than recognizing that lies often travel much faster than the truth does. And so with all of that said, I think we can understand why we need to look at this subject. At the same time, I think some Christians have a rather simplistic view of this. There are some Christians that just sort of figure, well, you know, what I have in whatever translation I use, that's really no different than any other translation. There are differences. There are things we need to understand. In fact, in the first 10 or 15 minutes of this presentation, once I get started anyways, I'm probably going to bother a number of you if you have not looked into this subject before. We need to recognize what the truth of the situation is regarding the history of the New Testament text. Our text has a history. It didn't just pop into existence one day. It did not come floating down from heaven in a leather binding with thumb indexing. That's not how it happened. It has a history, and we need to know what that history is so we can recognize the kinds of errors that people make when they start talking about the transmission of the text in the New Testament. Now, let me do a quick survey here. Of the Bible translation, some of you I know probably didn't bring a Bible this evening, and you know, you'll survive. No one's going to get angry at you about that. But how many ESV users do we have here? Man, Crossway did a good job. I did. Okay, how many New American Standard holdouts? Yeah, all right. Okay, how about King James?
Does that count New King James? Does that count?
How about New King James? Okay, all right. Does anyone have either an ESV or an NASB with them? ESV. Okay. All right, could you read for me, and you all look it up too if you'd like, Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 4. John chapter 5, verse 4. You're probably not going to be able to follow me very well because I will lose John chapter 5, Gospel of John chapter 5, verse 4. Having problems there, brother? Okay, there is no John 5:4 in the ESV or the New American Standard. There is a John 5:4 in the King James and the New King James. Now, if you're a young person and you can still read the footnotes in that tiny little 4-point font that they put down the bottom page, I can't see that anymore without my glasses anyways. You will notice that it is found at the bottom of the page. But the numeration in the text will go from John 5:3 to John 5:5. Now, I could show you just a couple others. There aren't very many, but I could show you a couple other places like that. And how many of you, over the years, have seen those little notes down at the bottom of the page that says some manuscripts read this way and some manuscripts read that way? How many have seen those little notes? Now, honestly, how many have been just a little bit bothered by those things? Okay. Hopefully by the end of the evening, you will at least understand why they're there and why they came into existence and why it's a blessing that we have them. And why it's really bad if we don't have them. And I'll explain all of that by the end of the evening. You're going to have to stay with me though. I realize this is the 21st century. And I realize that, for example, a couple weeks ago, I got to be on the Dr. Drew show on HLN, CNN. Anybody see that? Okay. You may notice that you have about 2.5 sentences before they change the topic. Okay, that's how it works in television today because they've done studies and they know that's about how long you've got to keep someone's interest before you've got to do something new and exciting for them. That's a crying shame, but that's the way our society is. I don't have the ability to do that for you. This subject is important enough for you to really focus in upon it. So I'll challenge you to do that, and guess what? I have to know that anyone's capable of doing that if we just use a little self-discipline. So I'm literally going to be throwing material at you that if you listen carefully, and you go back, and this presentation is on YouTube. I did it at Trinity Law School a number of years ago, and so you can go back and review it. That's obviously a really good thing to do. If you listen carefully to everything that I present here, you will know about as much of this subject as many seminary graduates do. That's only because a lot of seminaries today have completely de-emphasized any of this area of study. But you will have a solid ground for understanding why those notes are there, how we got the text in the New Testament, things like that. Now, in regards to John 5:4, there's all the information you ever need to know about John 5:4. We can move on from there, right? Now, I wish I could get a little better focus. That's as far as it wants to go, but it seems a little off for me. But the point of me putting up there, and I will explain this a little more later on, the point of my putting up there is this. Christians are wide open and transparent about our text. We're not hiding anything. We're not sweeping anything under a rug. Anyone of any religion can purchase that's the Logos Bible software up there. You've got Bible Works, you've got Accordance, you've got Olive Tree. I have all of this information now on my phone. Man, I wish I had had that during all the years we were staying outside the temple during General Conference. But now we have it on our phone. It is wide open and available to anyone. That is a blessing. That is a blessing, as I will be able to explain a little bit later on once we lay some foundation. Now, the current onslaught. Naturalistic materialism rules the day in academia. If you go into the universities, you go into the college campuses, naturalism, the idea that if you cannot weigh it, you cannot put it under a microscope and see it, you can't, it's not a part of the natural realm, then it doesn't exist. It simply doesn't exist. It's just mythology or whatever else you might want to call it. There's room right here for someone too if you want to sit next to it. I realize the projector probably putting a little heat off, but Anything that does not presuppose an uncreated universe and can be explained solely on the basis of naturalism is rejected a priori. You cannot use supernatural explanations for anything. This is what we have. And Christian claims, therefore, are relegated to the arena of myth. You're allowed to believe that, but that's just simply a religious myth. The idea of resurrection or creation or anything like that, that's just all been pushed into the realm of myth by the establishment of naturalism. So when we have, even on, sadly, the more conservative, few as they are, television networks, you'll have scholars on there. They will spin the evidence, particularly in media appearances. People like Bart Ehrman, who is an apostate. He graduated from Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, went to Princeton Seminary, and I'm sure Jason would admit, though that was once a bulwark of Presbyterian teaching, is now more like Princeton Cemetery than it is seminary. In fact, I think you can learn more by going to Princeton Seminary than going to cemetery than the seminary, because there's some really cool people in there.
You got the pictures in the...
Well, I know you got the pictures in there. I know they're all there, but I've been to the actual cemetery. It's Warfield, all that yards. It's great. Anyways, Bart Ehrman is probably the leading English-speaking critic of New Testament Christianity in the world today. The media loves him because he was once a believer by his own profession. Now he calls himself a happy agnostic. Knowing Bart, he is an agnostic. Not so happy. Not sure about the happy part personally, but his books are really tremendously read and devoured and repeated by so many people. My daughter, for example, she went to Glendale Community College. Her first semester, one of her professors was a rabid Bart Ehrman fan. He was a vile man. I mean, when I say vile, I mean she would bring home her MP3 recorder that I gave to her, and I didn't know you could use language like that in a university classroom, but evidently you can. It's academic freedom. Anyway, she ran into him, and unfortunately, he's not unusual. He's not unusual. That kind of vociferous attack upon our young people is a very, very common thing. And they get a lot of their information from Ehrman. Well, he will say, for example, that all we have are copies of copies of copies from hundreds of years after the originals. And therefore, we cannot have any idea what the original New Testament writings actually said. That is the attack. Now, realize there's two levels of attack, and we're going to be dealing with one category this evening. There are those who would say, well, sure, Matthew may have written this, but that doesn't mean that Jesus ever said it. Matthew could have been making this up. So that's not the area we're dealing with this evening. What we're dealing with this evening is, once these things were written, how do we know that we still have what was written by a Matthew or a Luke or a Paul or something along those lines? So we're looking at the transmission of that text over time, and can we have confidence in the transmission of that text? How has God preserved His Word? Do we just simply have to throw up our hands and say, I'm going to accept this particular version, and I'm going to make it the standard and reject everything else? There are some people who do that. I don't think you can defend that. I don't think you can go to the mat with a Bart Ehrman and just simply having said, I'm just going to sort of pick and choose and this is it. There has to be a foundation for us to be able to say, has God preserved His Word? I believe that He has, but how has He done so? That's the important part. Now, if you've seen this presentation before, please do not ruin it by giving me answers that I'm asking for. Okay? It always happens. I've always got somebody going, I've seen it before, and they'll throw it all out. There are approximately 5,770 cataloged manuscripts of all or part of the New Testament in the Greek language, the original language of the New Testament. Despite some of the weird things you might hear on Christian television or radio, the New Testament is written in Koine or Common Greek. About 5,700. That does not mean all those manuscripts contain all the New Testament. The older they are, the more fragmentary they are, for obvious reasons. But in 5,700 manuscripts, approximately how many variants do you think we would have? Now, what's a variant? Let me explain what that is. If one manuscript, or if a group of manuscripts has a sentence in a particular word order, and another group of manuscripts switches two words in that word order, even if it doesn't make any difference as to meaning, that's still a variant. If one manuscript spells a word with two N's, the new in Greek language, and other manuscripts only have one, that's a variant. So they can be big variants, like John 5:4 is, or they can be very small, minute variants. But it's still a variant. Approximately how many variants do you think exist in the New Testament manuscript tradition? This is where you can actually talk for a moment, just briefly. I have a laser, by the way, if you get out of Anyone? How many do you think you got?
400,000.
Right after I got done saying. Selective hearing. Selective hearing. Appreciate that. Normally we have an educational experience where I'll have people say 12, 20. Now think about what we're talking about. We're talking about handwritten manuscripts. You're talking about copying somebody else's handwriting over 1,500 years. So when you start hearing people say, oh, there might be 12, there might be 15, something like that, it really gives you an idea of where we are as far as an understanding of where the text is. So we have a basic guess would be about 400,000. Now, let me give you the bad news first, and then we'll put it all in context, and you'll see how it actually works out. In the Nestle-Aland, and I need to change this to the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, but I just haven't gotten around to it. Nestle-Aland 27th edition, the Greek New Testament, there are 138,162 words. So if you think about that, that's nearly 3 variants per word. That's what people are going to be told. My Muslim friends, when they make their presentation, this is the type of thing they'll say. 400,000 variants, that's 3 different possibilities for every word in the New Testament. And so obviously we cannot have any confidence that we continue to know what the New Testament originally said. And you might see a graphic, for example, like this. Here's the total number of words, here's the total number of variants. I mean, that just looks really, really bad. And I've listened to scholars make presentations where this is pretty much where they stop and move on from there. Now, just for my own interest, how many here would feel like if someone gave that kind of information to you, you would feel confident that you would be able to explain why there is still a reason to trust the New Testament in light of that information? How many would feel you could do that? Okay. How many of you have actually seen that presentation? Well, we already know. All right, let's look at what they don't tell you, and what therefore we very frequently will need to tell others, so that generally, so we can clear the way to be able to present what the New Testament actually teaches to others. 99% of all those variants do not impact the meaning of the text in any way, shape, or form. Variations in spelling and word order make up the vast bulk of the variants themselves. And in fact, 99% of them you could not explain to someone who could not read the Greek language. For example, a large number of these are involve what's called the movable nu. And in Greek, just as in English, you are supposed to put an N sound between vowels. So we're supposed to say, we are really supposed to say, an apple. Unless you're from where Jason comes from, then you sort of skip it. I think I'll have an apple pie. You know, that's sort of how but you're supposed to do the same thing in Greek, actually. And it's called the movable nu. I remember a guy in my first Greek class, I don't know what it was, the movable nu drove him insane, almost got him to fail Greek. That would have been a terrible thing. But there were some scribes that had the same thing. Now, it doesn't make a lick of difference as to how it translates in another language or anything else, but many thousands of those variants have to do with something like a movable nu or something along those lines that do not impact the meaning of the text. So about 1% of 400,000 equals 4,000 meaningful textual variants out of 138,162 words, about 2.9%, or one meaningful variant every 3 pages. But only half of these are viable. Now let me stop and discuss what viable means. If a scribe wakes up sometime in the 13th century and he had a really bad night, and he was interrupted in his sleep, and he's got very little sleep, and Starbucks isn't open on his way to the scriptorium, and I've already lost y'all. There were no Starbucks, but anyways, and his glasses are broken. Well, I didn't have those either, but he just had a really bad day. So he's copying his manuscript, and his mind is a million miles away. And so he makes an error that no one else has ever made. And he doesn't catch it. The proofreader doesn't catch it. And so now we have a manuscript today, and it has this error in it. It's the only manuscript that has it. It comes from the 13th century. That is not what is called a viable reading, because it has left no evidence of its existence in any part of the New Testament manuscript tradition. And by the way, it's not just Greek. As you'll discover later on, we have other translations. We have translations in other languages, the Latin, Laharic, Syriac, etc., etc. If it only exists in one manuscript, it's not viable. It's not possible that was the original reading. And so only about half of those are viable. So there's about 1,500 to 2,000 viable, they could be original, and meaningful New Testament textual variants. That is, they actually impact the meaning of the text. So that is quite a different picture, obviously, than what is presented before. In fact, if we change the graphic around now, here's the number of words, and there's the number of variants. Very different than what you saw before, but we rarely are given the opportunity of getting to actually explain these things, especially in the media today. Now, here's where I need you to think with me. Don't just listen to what I'm saying, but think with me. The more manuscripts you have for a particular word, the more textual variants you will have. So if you only have one manuscript, how many textual variants do you have? None. But think about it. If you only had one, what do you have to trust? That whoever made that one got it exactly right, because do you have any way of finding out if he made a mistake? None. There's no way of knowing. I understand the desire on the part of people. There are some Christians that sort of wish that the Bible was actually chiseled on stone, a la Indiana Jones in a long lost cave somewhere with a monk protecting it who doesn't age. You know. If we really want to know what it says, then you go up there and you ask the monk, and he goes in and he tells you what it says, and there would be no notes at the bottom of the page that way. I understand that desire on the part of people, but the reality is that's not what we have. That's not what we have in the Old Testament. Yeah, God wrote with his finger the Ten Commandments, but he then had those things copied down, and the kings were supposed to have scrolls and read from the law and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And when we come to the New Testament, the gospel is supposed to go all across the world, and toting the entire Bible around on stone would be very, very slow. It'd be very difficult to avoid the Roman soldiers, for example, if you've got a train full of stone tablets and that's your scriptures. So obviously that's not going to work. And so when you think about it, what's the best way to preserve an ancient text, realizing that printing, at least in the West, the Chinese got to it before we did, but printing, at least in the West, is not invented until the middle of the 15th century. You've got good old Gutenberg that comes along, and even then it took a while to catch on. You couldn't just all of a sudden have printing presses everywhere. You have to build them, you have to teach people how to use them. And even printing presses do not solve the problem completely, because for a long, long time, well, up until 1949, even with the printing press, you still had to manually set the type. So a lot of you are aware of the fact, for example, ever heard the Adulterer's Bible? The Adulterer's Bible was a version of the King James. That was one of the early printings of King James. And in typesetting the Ten Commandments at one point, the person typesetting it forgot the word not in the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And so a bunch of them were printed, and right there on the page it says, thou shalt commit adultery. And that's not because there was any difficulty in reading the Hebrew or anything like that at all. It was just simply typesetting issues. It wasn't until 1949 that we invented the photocopier. And from 1949 on beyond, you could make photographic copies. Well, I don't know. Some of you remember what the old photocopiers looked like, and what was that? The mimeograph. Remember the smell of the mimeograph? And well, some of those could still introduce some textual variants even after that. So that's the process. If you want to communicate the Scriptures, that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have it handwritten. And therefore, what is the best way to preserve that? To have as many manuscripts from as many different places and as many different streams of transmission as possible, so you can compare them with one another and be able to recognize when the scribe has made an error. And that's exactly what we have in the New Testament. In fact, I'll show you this later on, but let me tell you right now. There is no work of antiquity that comes even close to the New Testament as far as the number of manuscripts, purity of manuscripts, and the early age of manuscripts in the New Testament. If we don't know what the New Testament originally said, we don't know what any work of antiquity ever said. Any work of antiquity at all. That's just simply the reality of the case. Now, as I mentioned, there are more than 5,700 plus catalog manuscripts. The number changes. The number changed yesterday. You know why the number changed yesterday? Because Dan Wallace and his crew from the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts is over in Athens, and they're photographing manuscripts, and every time they do that, they discover new manuscripts. They discover that we may have said this was one manuscript. Once they start photographing it, they realize it's actually two manuscripts that put together, so now there's an extra manuscript, or so on and so forth, or this is actually part of another manuscript over there, so the number actually goes down. The number changes every year when Dan Wallace's team start going around the world doing the very valuable and important work that they're doing in cataloging these things. If you want to know why the work of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts is important, look what's happening in Iraq right now. Look at what ISIS is doing when they go into various places, destroying entire libraries and all the ancient manuscripts they contain. And if those have not been digitized, they're lost to us forever. They're gone. We will never have access to them. So it's a very, very important thing. Now, 5,700 plus, the average of which is about 350 pages long. That's over 2 million pages of text, grand total, 2 million pages of handwritten text, grand total. Now, that 1,500 to 2,000 meaningful and viable variants, over 2 million pages of hand-copied text spanning approximately 1,500 years prior to the invention of printing, is an amazingly small percentage of the text, reflecting an amazingly accurate history of transmission. One might say it's downright miraculous when you actually think about it. Now, a few years ago, I asked my computer, would you do this for me? And it graciously did so. And so what I did is I asked my computer to compare the two most dissimilar printed Greek New Testaments that we possess today. For those who are really into this type of stuff, this is a comparison of the Alexandrian and Byzantine text types. We might get into that later on, depends on how much time we have. Here is Ephesians 1 through 14. What's marked in green is where you have a difference between the two ends of the spectrum of the transmission of the text. The first thing you clearly see is, for the vast majority of the text, there is no difference whatsoever. None. Only where there's these green, for example, like here's the word in, but if you know Greek, you know that grammatic determination already told you it was in, so that's no big deal. You have an expansion of the name of Jesus. It says Christ Jesus in some manuscripts, just Christ in others. This one right here, you rarely see. That's actually an important one. It's the difference between ha and has in Greek. It's whether the Holy Spirit is referred to with a masculine or neuter pronoun. The natural pronoun would be neuter, but there are some manuscripts where it's masculine, which would sort of connect into John chapter 14. But as you can see, the vast majority of the text, no variation whatsoever. Book of Revelation, a little bit more. The book of Revelation has the fewest manuscripts of any New Testament book. And there's a reason for that. It's Tim LaHaye's fault. No. If you know the history of the church, you know that the book of Revelation struggled for inclusion in the New Testament canon. And by the way, that's a good thing. I don't think the New Testament church should be going, hey, we don't have enough books with seven-headed monsters and things like that. Can anyone come up with some more? We'd like to look at a few others. No, I think it's very good that the church said, was this really John? And what was the message? Did it have a meaning? And I think it was good that it was examined that way. And because it was examined in that way, we have the fewest manuscripts of the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at one later on. And when I present it to you, I'm going to tell you right then and there, do not ask me about what it means. Whenever I'm in a church, I say, ask the pastor. So we'll get to that one later on. So you might want to get a deep seat in the saddle there, Jason, because you may have to live up to Dan Wallace's real name. So, Book of Hebrews, chapter 6. Look at this. The book of Hebrews has the cleanest text of any in the New Testament. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that is. I don't have any major theories. That maybe I know that especially after the synagogue and the church went their separate ways in rather violent fashion, the book of Hebrews sort of became a closed book because you've got to know the Old Testament to understand the book of Hebrews. But there you have 6, 8 through 20, and there's only 3 little places, none of which really begin to impact the meaning of the text. So that gives you an idea of even the most dissimilar printed editions of the Greek New Testament. But even the 1500 to 2000 number needs to be understood. Even when the variant does impact the reading, in the large majority of instances, the careful student of the text can see which reading is the original. Many of these errors involve common scribal errors, mistakes we continue to make this very day when copying from one text to another. Here's an example from the history of the New Testament itself. And it is found in 1 John 3:1. If you want to look at your Bible, I'll be using the King James and New American Standard primarily as comparison here. King James says, behold, the measure of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. The New American Standard says, see how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we be called children of God. And such we are. For this reason the world does not know us, because it does not know him. The men in the audience who are colorblind, and there always are those who are, and such we are is in red. That is found in the New American Standard, ESV, NIV, the modern translations. It will not be found in the King James, the New King James, which are based upon something called the Textus Receptus, which is a Greek text that, if I have time to go into it a little bit later on, I'll give you some of the history and the story behind the TR. Now, and such we are is an affirmation of our adoption as sons and daughters of God. I mean, it's not an unimportant phrase. I mean, it's a very comforting phrase. It emphasizes the reality that we have been adopted into the family of God. So why wouldn't it be in the King James version of the Bible? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with those nasty Anglicans not liking adoption or whatever else. Unfortunately, most of the time, when things like this, when people discover differences between their translations and something like that, they automatically default to there must be some grand theological conspiracy going on type of thing. And that sells books, by the way. I mean, you can really preach it if the people you're talking to don't really know the history of the text. But the reality is, it's just simply the difference between the Greek text that was being translated by the King James, which was the same text used by the New King James translators in the 1980s, and the modern text that underlies ESV, NIV, NASB, so on and so forth. What we have here is a glowing example of homoi teleuton. Homoi teleuton, which is just a Latin way of saying similar endings. Similar endings. Now, this illustration used to work a whole lot better than it does today. I can guarantee you that this will work fine for Sandra. Because looking at all the quotes that you reproduce in books like Shadow of Reality, you had a book sitting there, and you had to type it in, right? Took forever.
Yeah.
Young kids today, it's cut and paste. I wrote all of my old papers back in college and the beginning of seminary anyways, on an IBM selector. How many of you have used an IBM selector? Yes. That is a small minority. The world has changed. This is why culture is collapsing. I mean, I really think that, I think the patience that was inculcated into us when you had to type out a paper and you had to remember to put a footnote at the bottom of the page. So when you're typing your paper, you always have to keep in mind, I got to put a footnote at the bottom of the page, got to put a footnote at the bottom of the page. But if you get distracted, all of a sudden you get down to the bottom of the page and you forgot the footnote. You know what you did? That's what you did. Start over again. Start typing the whole page over again. And when young people hear that, they're like, wow, there are dinosaurs walking by outside too. Wow, what a life you had, you know. And I just want to go, you need to respect your elders, you know. I mean, we had it rough. But the problem is, a lot of young people have not taken a book and sat there and done this thing. It's all electronic now. It's all Google scholarship. In the olden days, you had to sit there. You had what's called your exemplar, the original, and you either had to handwrite something or type something out, and you had to keep going back and forth, and the mind makes errors when that's happening. Hey, by the way, you can make errors even cutting and pasting. If you don't get the whole thing, you can cut off the beginning of the word, end word, but it's still a completely different thing. So, if you've never done it, then you have to take my word for it. But when you're sitting there, when you're looking at certain words that end in common grammatical endings, like tion, ing, es, os, these are how a lot of English words end. You type the word education, you look back at what you're copying, your eye sees a long word with tion at the end, you continue on, the problem is it's on the next line. And inadvertently, you have cut out material. Sometimes people repeated material because they weren't really paying attention to what they were copying. This type of thing happened in the history of the text as well. So, we go to 1 John 3:1. Here's the Greek text. You say, I don't read Greek. Well, I'll explain to you really quickly. Here's the phrase, kai esmen, and we are. So you have, in order that children of God we might be called, and we are, for this reason the world does not know us. And you'll see a little square right there. You look over the textual apparatus, it's right there. And these manuscripts do not have, and we are. So you've got KL049. We have lists of exactly where these are held, what the time range in which they were written, if we don't have an exact date, so on and so forth, when they are. It is important to know that little thing right there. Whenever you see it, see it's there, it's all over the place. That's the symbol for the majority text. The majority of Greek manuscripts do not contain this phrase. We'll explain what it is later on. And VGMS means certain manuscripts of the Vulgate, so the Latin doesn't contain it. But that doesn't explain why the variant took place. Here's something you need to understand. Here is what this would have looked like in the early days. It was called the uncial or majuscule text that predominated for the first 900 years of the history of the New Testament. What you need to understand is, for the first 900 years, the transmission of the text of the New Testament is written in all capitals, no spaces between words, and almost no punctuation. All capitals, no spaces between words, and almost no punctuation. It's just a long line of capital letters. Even people today who study Greek in seminary very rarely can read the early unsealed text because that's not what you're taught to read. I mean, it's the titles of the books will be in that, but that's about it. And so this is what you would have had. And I'll use color here. Notice it says kleithomen, we might be called kai esmen diatuta. Notice that kleithomen ends in what looks like M-E-N in English, U.S. New, and esmen ends in U.S. New. So an early scribe writes kleithomen. I goes back to what he's copying. He sees the U.S. New at the end of esmen, continues on from there. It's an inadvertent deletion of the intervening words. It's not purposeful. It's not somebody going, oh, I don't like the adoption of sons. It's not going to take this kind of stuff out. It's a common error of sight. Now, think about it. What if we only had one manuscript of 1 John? If we only had one manuscript of 1 John, we would never know. There would be no way for us to go back and go, But we have lots of manuscripts of of 1 John from different areas and different streams of transmission we can compare, and therefore we can recognize when something like this happens. That's why it's good that we have as many manuscripts as we have, because it helps us greatly. Now, I know I'm going fast because I've still got a lot of material to get to. That's why I said at the beginning, this whole presentation is on YouTube. And so if it goes a little bit too fast or a little bit too long, you can go back and catch it there and review it, because I think it is important. Now, the majority of the 5,700 plus Greek manuscripts date after 1000 AD. And that makes sense. I mean, the earliest manuscripts that we have are called papyri. That was made by taking the leaves of the papyrus plant, putting them at 90-degree angles, pressing them together. But they're made out of leaves. I mean, how good are you going to look 1,800 years from now? You know, I mean, the very fact we have any papyri at all is pretty amazing, and I'm going to show you a number of them here in a little bit while. As I said, unsealed or manuscript text, all capital forms, no spacing, almost no punctuation whatsoever. I'm going to have to skip past a couple of these just for time reasons. Here is a graph where I gave you an idea of the manuscripts. You can see that after the 10th century, here's the centuries on the side. After the 10th century, here's where the majority come from. They're called minuscules, so they're large and small letters spaced between words, sort of as Greek appears to us today in our manuscripts. But the blue are the papyri manuscripts. The green are what are called unseals, which are on parchment, which is animal skin but very thinly sliced, amazingly thinly sliced, beautiful manuscripts. And then you can see once minuscules was developed very quickly, it took over, and you have the majority of them appearing here. There's also something just briefly to mention that I think you want to keep in the back of your mind. The New Testament was transmitted through history. Certain things happened in history. One of the things that happened in history was that starting the 3rd century or so, the Western Church moved from Greek to Latin as its primary language. And that's going to reduce the number of Greek manuscripts that are being produced. But then, what happened between 632 and 732? Thank you. Islam. Muhammad dies in 632. For 100 years, Islam expands without being stopped until Battle of Tours in 732 in France. And so all of North Africa, for example, which had been a Christian area, Augustine was in Hippo, Carthage, these were all Christian centers. All of North Africa was taken over by Islam. That's not going to be overly good for the production of Greek manuscripts. And so the manuscripts that were prevalent around what is called today Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, or Byzantium, those are the ones that are going to continue to be copied the most, because Greek is still being spoken there. And that's why that particular manuscript type is the most prevalent in the manuscripts that we have today. But that, if you're thinking about it, doesn't necessarily mean that what was in Byzantium is the best version of the New Testament. It just is going to have the most manuscripts. Keep in mind what happened in history. It's very, very important. All right. I try to respect my audiences. You know, there'd be some people that say, you know, you could make this a lot more interesting presentation if you were more entertaining, or if you didn't try to, you know, give so much information. I think that especially believers in Jesus Christ should be called to a higher standard. And so one of the things that I've discovered is audiences love having an opportunity to see some of these manuscripts that are being noted down the bottom of the page. Your translation may not give you that information. You can easily obtain it, both online as well as digitally, or purchasing Greek New Testaments. They're available at Amazon, cheap, etc., etc. You can get all this information. It's easily done. But I like to show you some of the manuscripts, so it's not just, well, scholars have these things hidden off someplace. I think it's personally very exciting to be able to see some of these. Now, how many of you saw the CNN story about 4 months ago about the Egyptian funerary mask? Just a couple people. We may have discovered some very early fragments of the New Testament. We're not certain yet. Some people jumped the gun saying that, talking about this. What's turned out is that we've discovered in some Egyptian funerary masks. And the cheaper funerary masks they made of paper mache, basically. They use scrap papyri to make these funerary masks. Well, lo and behold, no one ever thought to look at it, but you started examining that papyri that was used there. There may have been some scraps in the New Testament. This hasn't been published yet, hasn't been dated yet, but it's possible, it's been said, that in one of these funerary masks, a fragment of the Gospel of Mark has been found from the 1st century, which would be within just a matter of decades of the actual writing of the Gospel of Mark itself. Now, can't prove that one yet. Can't prove that one yet. But keeping that in mind, what you're looking at right now is up until this new find, the generally agreed upon earliest fragment of the New Testament that we possess, P52, which is not a fighter plane for those of you who are over $2 like I am, but that was a great fighter plane, by the way. But anyways, in real life, it is about the size of a credit card. It is written on both sides. There was a young scholar leafing through papyri, little pieces of papyri, in a cardboard box in a basement in London in the 1930s. Remember, the British had basically stolen everything from Egypt when they ran the place, and that's why the British Museum is so cool. Anyways, and so you look at this little piece of papyri and realize this is the middle of sentences. In fact, here's what it would have looked like. We actually have fonts that match the papyri now. It's so cool to be able to do that. I'm such a geek, as you're going to see in a moment. But this is sort of how the text would flow around P52. And so this guy has to be so good that he can read partial words in the middle of sentences and still figure out what is actually being said. And he recognized this was from the New Testament. And lo and behold, I normally go into a whole long discussion here, but I have to cut it short. In the 1870s, if you had gone to seminary in Germany, you would have been told that the Gospel of John was written around 170 AD. That was the assured result of modern scholarship. Well, guess what P52 is from? It's from the Gospel of John. And when they found it, they sent to the 4 leading papyrologists in the world. Now, you may have a very honest question. How do you date a papyrus? You go, hey, how do you want to go out and check it out? A little papyrological humor. You got to do something, you know? Basically, what you do is, if it's not found with something that would give you a date, like with a secular manuscript, which would give you at least the latest date because it would have a date in it, it would make reference to a certain Caesar, what years, and like that. It's based upon the form of penmanship, because the Caesars would bring in their own scribes who would have their own type of writing, and that would then filter down to the scriptorians in places like that. And so this was dated to around 125. What you do is you do a 25-year range each direction, so you have a 50-year range. So as early as 100, as late as 150. So that's the range in which P52 would fall, okay? And it's interestingly enough from John chapter 18. On the one side is verses 31 to 34, on the back side 37 to 38. And what's that about? That's when Jesus is talking with Pilate. And Jesus says, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate's response to that is, what is truth? And I find it fascinating that the earliest papyrus fragment we have, that's what it contains. But here it is. And I told you, because I'm a geek, here is, this is I did a debate with Martin Ehrman back in 2009, I believe it was. And please notice my tie. It is P52. Both sides. Both sides fully readable. Don't worry, the original manuscript was not damaged in destruction this time. And you can't really see it here because of the light and stuff, but that's Martin Ehrman, and I'm giving him his own P52 tie. That was the first time from the debate he smiled. So I don't know what he did with it. I don't know if he burned it. I don't know if he wears it once a semester to mock fundamentalist weirdos like me or something. I don't know, but that's what I gave Martin a P52 tie was on. So there you go. Now, here is where any and all questions about what I'm about to show you what it means. This is Pastor Jason. call us and answer your questions afterwards because I don't get into this in anybody's church. But here's P115, and it is one of only 2 early papyrus manuscripts we have of the book of Revelation. And this happens to be the page. Now this is what it would have looked like, so you can see we're missing all this stuff, all right? But this is, and I unfortunately cannot even see any of it there. Normally you could read it, but you'll have to take my word for it. This is from Revelation chapter 13. In Revelation chapter 13, we learn the number of the beast. Now, we all know what the number of the beast is. In fact, I imagine we could go out and we could stop a biker out here on Magna Main Road here. We go, what's the number of the beast? You go, 666. Everybody knows the number of the beast is 666, right? Here's the problem. In the 2 earliest manuscripts we have the book of Revelation, it's not 666. It's 616. 616. And if the light wasn't such, I can show you where it is there. But now, that's why I don't get into what this means. Because in some of the churches I speak at, this could be very troubling information. Some of you are old enough. I remember when Henry Kissinger, they added his name up, and it was 666. I think they got Nixon. I know they got Hillary at some point. Everybody's name ends up adding up to 666, but if it's 616, who might that be? That could be Donald Trump. I mean, who knows? Now, I will at least give you the other Dan Wallace's theory of what we have here. And I think he's figured it out. 666 is the number of the beast, and 616 is the number of the neighbor of the beast. Little bit of texture, critical humor. It's always good. Always good. Now, this next one, even with the light the way it is, it's still readable. This is an amazing picture. This is P72. It's around AD 175 to 200. You can actually see right here, Petru Epistolae Bay. Petru Epistolae Bay, which would be 2 Peter. So Alpha would be 1 Peter, then you got 2 Peter, Beta would be. So 2 Peter, so this is the end of 1 Peter, right here. This is the earliest manuscript that we have of 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude. Now, I saw this very page in 1993 in Denver. It was during World Youth Day. Pope John Paul was in town, and so they had the Vatican Treasures exhibit. And the Vatican happens to have this one. They've got a lot of interesting stuff. And Rick Pierce and I were sitting at a health food store called Winchell's, and I was reading the newspaper, and they were talking about what was going to be on display. Well, I saw that a page of P72 was actually, Rich, we're going. So we go into this display. It's one of the first things they have there. It's under glass, and I go walking over to it, and I'm going, oh man, look at this. I mean, you can sort of barely see it, but there's a line right there, there. There's one over here. These are called nomina sacra. We don't know why, but Christians abbreviated God, Jesus, Lord, Spirit, a number of words that were repeated many times. For some reason, they abbreviated them, cut them down to either 2 or 3 letters, depending on the scribe, and put a line over the top of it. We don't know why. Lots of theories, we don't know why. But it marks Christian manuscripts. And so I'm looking at all these nomina sacra, and then what's really cool is if you know 2 Peter 1:1, there's this phrase right here. And this is remember the Da Vinci Code? How many of you will admit to having read the Da Vinci Code? How many of you will admit to having watched the Da Vinci Code? Okay, all right. You'll be excommunicated later. But anyway, There was a time period where everywhere I traveled, every gate that I was at an airport, somebody was sitting there reading that insane book, which was a fiction book, in case anyone forgot about that part. It was in the fiction center aisle at, wherever it was. Anyways, what was the theory? The theory was that Constantine got everybody together, the Council of Nicaea, gathered up all the Gospels, came up with a new Jesus who wasn't married, didn't have kids, was a divine being, and he came up with the idea in 325 AD. Well, anyone who knows church history knows that that is basically his facts were 180 degrees opposite the reality. And here's an example. Here's a manuscript that was written long before Constantine was ever born, and if you know 2 Peter 1:1, this is called the Grand Chart Construction. And here it says, our God and Savior, Jesus Christ, is both God and Savior, being applied to one person, Jesus Christ, according to the grammar of the text. And so long before Constantine, here you have documented evidence that this is what Christians believe. Well, so I'm translating it, and I'm looking at it, and people would come up and they sort of look at the description and look at that and look at me and then look over at Rich and go, can he read that? And Rich would go, yeah. Come here, Harold, this man's reading this ancient. And so people start gathering around, and the security people are doing this number, so we could grab me and we go look at a tiara for a while and some diamonds or something and right back again. And eventually they sort of suggested we need to move along. But it was so exciting because you'll notice the handwriting's not bad, but it's not super special either. This was probably just a literate Christian, probably went into a church assembly someplace, and they started reading from this. He goes, what's that? These are the writings of Peter. We don't have that in our church. Can I copy that? Sure, you bet. He writes it down, takes it to his church. Now, of course, after about 50 or 60 AD, that can cost you your life in many places, especially from 250 to 313, that's when you have the worst period of persecution. Even carrying this, you could have lost your life. I wonder how much the Bible we would have if we had to write our own copies. We can't get people to come to Sunday school on time. So I look at this, and I've almost got tears in my eyes when I think about, here is a fellow believer 1,800 years ago that loved the Scriptures and risked themselves to have it. And the other neat thing was, and I knew at that time, if I had my Nestle-Aland 27th edition Greek New Testament, I could have reproduced every word of that manuscript just from that New Testament and the notes that are on the page. Every word. That's an amazing thing to think about. That's an amazing thing to think about. So there's P72. Here is P75. This is the end of Luke, the beginning of John. And this is a very important Gospels manuscript. Whoever copied this was a very good copyist. And that's important. This guy was talented. You'll see that cited very often when we have the portion of it. It was once all the Gospels. It's only a portion of the Gospels now, unfortunately. But you can see it's made of papyrus. You can see how the papyrus is broken along the edges and things like that. But again, how good are you going to look at 1,800 years is what I was asking people to talk about. Here's P66. Now what I like about this one is normally what you have is just a picture of a page, but here you can see what the book looked like. And you can see the spine over here, and then you can see that on the outer edges, the upper edge, and then especially the lower edge is where you get most of the wear and tear. And that's the same. Look at your Bible. Even today, that's where the wear and tear is going to be. So this kind of shape like this is very common. You're going to see it in P46 in a moment, very same shape. This also is from the Gospel of John, John 1:1. And there's more proof that Dan Brown made millions of dollars off of nothing. Last phrase of John 1:1, Kai Theos, Ein Ha Logos, and the Word was God, from John 1:1. This again, the Gospels manuscript, very important one that we have as well. And then here's P46. Now, here's where you need to participate again. Here's where you need to participate. I'm going to tell you something. I'm starting to develop a little bit of a complex here. I'll tell you what. I've asked audiences literally now around the world to participate at this point in the presentation. What book of the New Testament is anonymous? Unless you have the King James, and then it says the Epistle of Paul, but anyways. Now, there are lots of theories as to who wrote it. Paul, Apollos. My personal theory is that it was a sermon of Paul written by Luke. That Paul originally preached it in Hebrew Aramaic, and then Luke wrote it, because I guarantee you one thing, I've translated all of Paul, I've translated the book of Hebrews, and the same person did not write those two books. The grammar is really different, the vocabulary is really different, but the thought's the same. Luke, Acts, very similar to Hebrews. Now, P46 is the earliest collection of Paul's writings that we have. First time we have all Paul's writings in one place, P46. Now here's the question, and you all get to vote. The question is going to be, does P46 contain Hebrews, or does it not? Now before you vote, here's why I'm starting to develop a little bit of confidence. Every time I ask this question, there are people who sit there right where you're sitting and refuse to vote. They will not vote. I'm just simply asking. I just want everybody to participate. And there are people who don't. Why? I'm not going to mock you. But it hurts. It really it hurts. You know, it's like when people mock my bow tie. You know, it hurts. No, it doesn't actually. But by the way, this is a real bow tie. It is a tied bow tie. That means I tied it at the hotel today. How many of you here tied? Men, young men. How many of you can tie a tie? God, yes. Were you forced to learn that, or you didn't want to learn that? Okay, here we go. I'm watching everyone. How many of you think that P46 contains Hebrews? Vote anyway. How many of you think it doesn't? How many of you think it does not contain Hebrews? How many of you did not vote? It contains Hebrews. It contains Hebrews. So there you go. Now all that tells you is that someone around the year 200 thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. Prove one way or the other, but it does contain Hebrews. So this actually is Crossville Ephesians. This is to the Philippians. I have seen this page in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, Ireland. I will tell you quickly, we almost got kicked out again. The reason was they have it under this very, very, very subdued light for obvious reasons. And I was trying to read it, and we came up with this brilliant idea that what light there was in the case above the manuscript, and so it was bouncing off the manuscript like this. So where would it be the brightest? Down here. So I'm sitting here like this, doing this number, looking up. Okay, I can see a lot better now. All right, here's, well, they have closed circuit cameras on the manuscripts. I can just see the security guys going, oh great, the Christians are worshiping the manuscripts again. And so security guys show up and we're explaining, we're trying to read them, like, yeah, sure, right, yeah. So anyways, but I saw that very page. What really bummed me is I wanted to see the Carmen Christi. I wanted to see Philippians 2:5-7. They had the page flipped over. Had the page flipped over. I'm like, but anyway. So that's in the Chester Beatty Library. Like I said, I am a geek. This is P91. It's just a little fragment here. This is actually 1/3 of P91. The other 2/3 are in Milan, Italy. And here I am holding it. This is in Sydney, Australia. I had half a day off when I was speaking there. And I said, what do you want to go do? Now, when my wife came down with me, she climbed the Sydney Harbor Bridge. That's my wife, okay? What I do? I knew that P91 was there, so we went to Macquarie State University. And the curator of the museum there was very glad to show it to us. And in fact, he's a papyrologist. And after talking with him for a while, I came to a very distinct conclusion that his wife had gotten bored with papyrology about 40 years earlier. And so he was excited to have somebody to talk papyrology with. And so we had a lot of fun. And so there's P91. It's from the book of Acts, end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, from around AD 250 or so. Now, going back to the facts here and trying to keep the pace going. After the peace of the church in AD 313, that's when persecution ended under Emperor Constantine, at least in the area of control. It took a year or two elsewhere. Christians could have professional scribes copy the scriptures without fear. At this time, the great vellum or leather manuscripts begin to appear, including the three greatest of these, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are symbolized by olive and wheat, may well have been among the Bible's copied with imperial moneys at the time of the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Constantine gave some money to copy manuscripts because the Romans had been destroying them for years. And so some manuscripts were made at that time. The greatest of these is Codex Sinaiticus. And this is pretty much exactly what it looked like in 2005 when I saw it at the British Museum in London. I walked into this room. There was nobody there. I walked right up to Sinaiticus. It was sitting right there. Alexandrinus was sitting right next to it. Behind me was a Tyndale Bible, a Wycliffe Bible, an original 1611 King James. And there was nobody there. I'm just sort of looking around going, how did this happen? I mean, are you allowed to do this? You know, am I going to get arrested? What's going on? Well, that's pretty much what it looked like, but that really doesn't give you an idea of what a professionally copied manuscript looks like. There is Sinaiticus. Remember, folks, that's not printed, that's handwritten. All right? And yet, it's still handwritten. There's something in the margin there. There's something in between lines right there. If this was written, say, in 350, between 325 and 350, it was in use until the 1800s. So think about, that's a long time. That's a lot of people using the same manuscript. So there's lots of notations. There's things that we found here that were written in 700 years after it was originally written. So it is a fascinating text. And if you'd like to see Sinaiticus, you can go to codexsinaiticus.org, and there you can zoom in, high-quality digital photography. You can either view it straight on, light straight on, or even raking light, where you can see the surface of the parchment. It's really fascinating. It really is. I can tell you lots more stories on this, how it was found, everything else, but it's already 15 after, and I still got a lot more to go. So I apologize for the speed I go through these. Codex Vaticanus, obviously the Vatican Library. Up until recently, this was about all I could give you. It is now fully online as of 3 months ago. Once again, in high-quality digital photography, so you can look for yourself. It's not quite as pretty because about somewhere around the 1500s, some poor monk, I don't know if it was penance or what, went back over the entire thing. And by the way, Sinaiticus also contains the Old Testament in Greek as well. So it's Old and New Testament. It's a complete Bible. Now, some portions of it missing, but it was at one point a complete Bible in Greek. Vaticanus the same way, though Vaticanus ends at Hebrews 9:14, just because the last part fell off at some point in its history. But some poor monk had to go through and retrace every letter because it was faded. That also reduces some of its value because now the monk had to get it right, but that's Codex Vaticanus. And the next Codex Alexandrinus is a beautiful manuscript from around AD 400. I have a tie made out of something from that, but I don't have time to go into that right now either, because we need to get back to the facts here. Now, aside from the 5,700 plus Greek texts, we have early translations in the Latin, Coptic, Sinaitic. There are important witnesses to the early text of the New Testament. Combining these, the Greek text yields over 20,000 handwritten witnesses to the New Testament. We have more than 124 Greek manuscript witnesses within the first 300 years after writing the New Testament. Maybe more if these new ones pan out. Almost undoubtedly more. No matter where they're dated, they're certainly not going to be this date. So that number must increase. It's going to get higher. Far more than any other work of antiquity. In fact, what we need to understand, we have 12 manuscripts, maybe more now. Oh, okay, you should have just waved at me. We need to changed the memory card out on the video recorder, so we're going to take just a second here. I could do finger puppets. I could do. I don't know that we'll do that, but I will take that. I'll do what you can't do, but at least I'm talking, so I'm all right. What does that mean? The people are writing around the same time in the New Testament. The normal time frame between when they wrote and the first copies we have of what they wrote is 500 to 900 years later. Now these are the same sources that are quoted in all our history books, everything else. Okay? 500 to 900 years. Now I say, know this submission by Bart Ehrman. I unfortunately can't play you video because we don't have any way of you hearing it. But during my debate with Bart Ehrman, I asked him some questions during the cross-exits. People weren't exactly sure why I was asking, but there was reason I asked. And I asked him about this time, he talks about how great this time frame is. And I asked him, I said, in comparison to Suetonius or Pliny, what would you say about them? I said, oh, ginormous amount of time. And then these are the words he said. I've played it so many times I've memorized it. We have much earlier attestation for the New Testament than for any other work of antiquity. Now that is the leading English-speaking critic of the New Testament. And he doesn't have any problem saying we have much earlier attestation than for any other work of antiquity. I think Ehrman would also admit we have more, and as far as quality goes, we have the best. Now that doesn't sell you a lot of books today, unless you're selling them at the Christian bookstore. So you're not going to hear a lot of that said, but that's what he said. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now here's a neat graphic that a fellow down in Australia put together. And here is your point of origin. And then these circles represent the number of manuscripts you have of some of these ancient works. So the big guy here is Homer. We have 643 manuscripts. And it's about 500 years between when it was written and our first manuscripts of Homer. Plato, has anyone ever understood Plato? Has anyone ever liked Plato? I don't think Plato liked Plato. So you have only 7 manuscripts, and you have 1,200 years between when it was originally written and the first manuscripts. Caesar does a little bit better. He's got 10 manuscripts, and you're looking at 1,000 years. This is not the Son. That's the New Testament. Okay? So in comparison to all these other ancient works, here is the number of manuscripts we have now, that's including translations, and then how close it is to the time of its origination. And so you've got people running around saying, we have no idea what the New Testament originally said. And you look at that and go, I think you've got an agenda. What do you think? Yeah, I think you do. Most definitely. Fascinating we put it into a graphical format. Now, very often, the transmission of the text of the New Testament is like in the phone game that we used to play when we were kids. Remember? Maybe they don't do it anymore. Maybe it's politically incorrect. Play the phone game. But I remember when I was a kid, you'd get in a circle, and the teacher would whisper something in one person's ear, and then they'd whisper it around. Look at the last person. Now it's in Swahili. And we'd all laugh and ha 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 ha. Well, very frequently, that's how the New Testament is presented. That, well, you had one scribe and he made mistakes, and somebody copied his mistakes and made more mistakes, and somebody copied his mistakes and made more mistakes. And so it's just this snowball rolling downhill, collecting all these mistakes, right? Well, that's what we're told happened, but is that really how the New Testament was transmitted over time? Well, the reality is that is not how it happened. Instead, what you've got is the initial Gospels, and by the way, I designed this graphic myself, so if you want to go, thank you very much. Makes my little bow tie heart feel good. Anyways, the initial Gospels and Epistles of the New Testament were written at various places at various times. Some were written for distribution within the community, such as the Gospels. Others were epistles sent to specific locations. There we go. Then copies were made and sent elsewhere. Often Christians traveling one place to another, like I mentioned before, would encounter a book they'd not heard of before, hence would make a copy to bring back to their own fellowship. And And although a graphic that would show and represent how many different lines of transmission there were would become sort of useless to us, the idea is that we have all these different lines of transmission taking place in the transmission of the Gospels. Over time, single books would be gathered together. They're going together again here. And they'd be gathered together into one collection. These collections then would come together until finally, after the Peace of the Church in AD 313, you could have entire copies of Scripture such as we find Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. But the important point to note is what I call the multifocality of the process. Multiple authors writing it multiple times to multiple audiences. The New Testament was not written at one point by one group. And that means it was never under the control of any one group either. And this is something that you really, really need to get hold of. I know you've been sitting patiently for a while, but you need to get hold of this. This is going to help you to understand why we can trust the text of the New Testament. It's vitally important to realize the transmission of the text of the New Testament did not follow a phone game single line. Not only a written document is less liable to corruption than what is whispered in the ear, but the phone game involves a single line of transmission. The New Testament originated in multiple places, written by multiple authors, with books being sent to multiple locations. And what makes that important? Well, this multifocality leads us to the final consideration to demonstrate the bankruptcy of the modern attacks on the New Testament. To make specific changes to the text like the New Testament, which originally circulated as a group of texts. Remember, P66 was Gospels. P72 was 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude. P46, Paul. So they originally circulated as groups of texts, not as a single body. To make changes would require a centralized, controlling body that could make wholesale changes in these widely dispersed texts. The fact of the matter is, no such central agency ever existed, or could have existed. Christianity was a persecuted religion made up mainly of the lower classes. There was no central authority that could ever have gathered up all the texts, made wholesale changes. Such was impossible in the earliest days of transmission, and given that we have such ancient texts now, obviously could not have happened at a later point without giving clear evidence of it having taken place. So, we can prove beyond all doubt this kind of corruption did not happen, since papyri had been found to date back to the 2nd century, and that only within the past 100 years. Had any later centralized organization sought to alter the text, those later texts would have shown stark differences as older and older manuscripts were found. Just the opposite has been the case. So in other words, remember Shirley MacLaine? How many of you are old enough to remember Shirley MacLaine? Okay. Remember when she went loopy back in the late 1980s? You're all going, she wasn't always loopy? No. Remember, she got into the New Age. And this is the illustration I did, and you thought the exact same thing. She did this mini-series on TV called Out on a Limb. And she gets a guru, they're doing trans-channeling, and she would contact the spirit Ramtha and all the rest of that stuff. And her guru has her walking along the seashore, and he's teaching her, say, I am God, I am God, I am God. We're all sitting home going, no, you're not, no, you're not. And she used to travel around and do these seminars and tell people that the Bible used to teach reincarnation, but they took it out at the Council of Constantinople in 381. And we all sit here and go, what do you say to that? I mean, most of us have never examined the writings of the Council of Constantinople. Most wouldn't know even what year it took place, etc., etc. The reality is, of course, from a historical perspective, there is absolutely not a shred of evidence of that. But here's the problem. We have entire manuscripts of the whole Bible now that were written long before 381. So if reincarnation had been in there, those manuscripts, which were, some of the papyri were already buried in the sands of Egypt by then, we'd find it in those earlier manuscripts. There's nothing there. We found these earlier manuscripts. There is absolutely no evidence of any kind of wholesale editing or changing. What you have is your standard scribal errors that happen over time. You don't have doctrines being put in, doctrines taken out. There are not many plain and precious truths that have disappeared from the text of the Bible, and we can document that from the manuscripts themselves now. So, what that means is, All allegations of purposeful corruption, such as those made by Muslims, very commonly today, or anyone else, fall upon the mere consideration of the historical context of the date itself, the rapid, widespread distribution of New Testament manuscripts in the first 2 centuries. Remember, Christians wanted the word to go everywhere. They wanted the gospel to go everywhere. And so if you came along and said, I want to make a copy, they didn't say, can I see your copyist card? We need to make sure you're properly trained. No, they let everyone copy the scriptures, and so they exploded across the known world. That is how God preserved the text. Because there is no way that anyone could ever gather all those things up and make changes in them. Now the result is the small number, relatively small number of textual variants we have to examine. But think of the alternative. Think of the alternative. There is a major text of a world religion that was not translated that way. It's called the Quran. And if you know the history of the Quran, there's a book that came out a couple years ago called What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran. I want to pick it up. Local Christian bookstore. If you'd like to see some debates between the author of that book and certain Islamic apologists, one from London and one from Potchefstroom, South Africa at Northwest University. Those are available on YouTube. Very different debates, but very interesting. The reality is that the Quran was a controlled transmission. The New Testament is what's called a free transmission. The text was thrown out there and transmitted freely. Nobody controls it. The Quran is a controlled transmission of the text. Because between 650 and 652, somewhere around there, the third caliph, Uthman, gathered the manuscripts together, made an official version, sent out copies of his official version to the chief Islamic cities, and destroyed everything he used to make the official version. Well, he thought he did. We actually have some evidence from Abdullah ibn Masud and others. I'm not going to get into that right now. I have a whole presentation on that, not enough time. Anyway, the point is, it was an official version. Now, I don't know about you, I don't think I would ever use the Obama Bible. I wouldn't use the Bush Bible either, by the way. I would not use any officially demanded governmental version of the Bible. But that's what the Quran basically is an official version provided by the Islamic State. Now, not the Islamic State back then, not the Islamic State today, obviously. Huge difference, because if Uthman changed anything and then he destroys everything that comes before, how do you know? You can't know. And so it is far better to have a free transmission of the text than a controlled transmission of the text. And if you especially want to see people struggling with this, watch the debate from London when I debated on this subject, and my opponent just, no matter how hard I tried to explain it, just could not break away from the idea that no, it's better to have the controlled text. You want to have that official text. It's fascinating to watch, but that is the difference between the two. Now, very quickly, but this leads to another important point. When scribes copied their text, they were very conservative, often incorporating marginal notes into the text since they could not be sure if the note was original or not. We saw one of those. Which one was it? John 5:4. Vast majority of scholars believe John 5:4 was a marginal note. Some of us even write in our Bibles today, right? Well, if you were copying somebody else's manuscript, maybe they're dead. You can't go back and ask, was this your explanation? Or was this something that was supposed to be there that you inadvertently left out and then fixed? Christian scribes tend to be very conservative. They would include what they found in the margins in their own copy so as to not lose anything. That's an important thing. Because what that means is that the New Testament text is what is called tenacious. This may sound bad at first, but consider what it really means. The New Testament text is tenacious. That means readings are preserved in the text. All readings, including the original readings, are still a part of the manuscript tradition. So that means, that's why the believing textual critic can persevere in even the most difficult variants. One of the readings is the original. What does that mean? Well, think of it this way. What would you rather have? A 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle with 10,100 pieces, or 9,900 pieces? Which would you rather have? You'd rather have to work through the extra pieces and still know you have all the 10,000 to make the jigsaw puzzle than to have any of you ever done like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and then discover your cat ate the last piece? And then the cat disappeared too? If the New Testament text was not tenacious, then we would not be able to say we continue to have the original readings. When I debated Bart Ehrman, I asked him, Dr. Ehrman, if you reject the tenacity of the New Testament text, can you show us anywhere in the New Testament where you believe the original reading has been completely lost? And the leading critic in the English-speaking world came up with one example in Peter where he says instead of the word Enoch, it should be and something else. Has zero impact on the message of anything, and that's all he came up with. It's the only thing. He's the leading critic. He's the leading critic. Because the tenacity of the New Testament text is an observable reality. We possess all the original readings of the New Testament. They're there. We may have to work through some variants, but one of the variants is the original reading. It's still there. It's vitally, vitally important. Let me give you one quick example, and then I will release you from your suffering to attack the wonderful refreshments we have, or whatever else we do. Let me give you a key theological example. Normally what I do in a situation like this is I go through a number of examples, because I think it's important to demonstrate that we can... Theories sound great, but when you have to actually create a text, that's when the theories are tested to see if they really work. There's a lot of neat theories out there, but I'll just tell you honestly, I have people I respect, I have people in the Reformed tradition that have certain views, but I hope they never take those in a debate with Bart Ehrman, because he'd shred it. If our theories cannot survive going out there against the best the world has to offer, then maybe we should be abandoning those theories. Sometimes we have theories that work real well just within our own little communities, but I want to go out there and say something outside of just our little communities. In 1 Timothy 3:16, let's compare the KJV and the New American Standard. King James, I'll go quickly here, has the phrase, God was manifest in the flesh. New American Standard says, He who was revealed in the flesh. Now, that's a big difference. That's a big difference. In the King James, Jesus is identified as God. In the New American Standard, He's not. It's a big difference. So, people have preached sermons, and it's all about the unbelieving, terrible, horrible liberals, and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Let's look at the evidence here real quick. Here's the Greek New Testament. Has evanarothe and sarki, who was manifest in the flesh. There's a little thing right there. You go over here. Codex D, by the way. Did you know? I was joking with somebody about the Living Bible recently. Living Bible is not really a new thing. Codex D was the Living Bible of the early church. Codex Vese Cambridgiensis is what this is here. It's a Greek-Latin dialogue. It's so weird. The author was clearly trying to sort of make improvements and stuff. For example, when Peter is released from prison, remember the angel let him out? Codex D tells us he descended 29 steps to the street. Who knew? Of course, it's the only nature of the world that says it, but it's just really odd. Here is the word theos, God, and you'll see that correctors of these manuscripts corrected it to God, but the original of these manuscripts was what's in the text, which is just simply has. But that doesn't explain what's really going on here. When you have people who try to say, oh, it's all a conspiracy, see if there is actually a logical answer first, because there is here. Here is